Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to Frankenstein Tea. I'm Kristen. I'm the library director of the Island Free Library on Block Island. I am in the library right now. I am upstairs in the upper level of the library, ready to bring you my daily short story program, which is called Frankenstein Tea. And it is short stories for adult listeners with a little bit of a check-in. See how you're doing today. See how I'm doing today. How's the library doing? My dad just signed on. Hi, Dad. Maybe my mom is out there. Hi, Mom. Having a little coffee. Was a outdoor library day for us today at the Island Free Library. That means we're open for library services at our front door and on our front lawn and at our back kids garden takeout window. We were pretty busy today. It was a little busy out there. There's still people working out there. We leave the tables up even when we shut down the services, even when we're not out there, because we have to actually come inside and do other work and other parts of our jobs. So, but there's still people working out there. So it's a work day on Block Island. You know, I think things are changing. Again, we'll see what happens, right? Rhode Island schools have a delayed start opening, and it is still unsure whether they're going back in person or virtually. So, you know, things are changing, still things changing in Rhode Island and across the country. My kid goes back to school next week. He has been in an online school. He'll continue in his online high school. And he starts in 1 week. Can't believe it, 1 week of summer. Oof. But he's on the beach today, so good for him. All right, so I'm having a little coffee for today's program, as I've said. And I'm going to read F. Scott Fitzgerald today. That's what I'm going to read. It's a little old-fashioned classic there, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald from I Die for You and Other Lost Stories. It's edited. Let's see. Let's do this properly. This is edited. Who edited this? What's her name? Come on. I just had her name. It is edited by Anne Margaret Daniel. This book was published by Simon & Schuster in 2017. And so the editor has, a note here as well as an introduction. And I'm going to read just a little bit from the introduction. Then I'm going to read the short story that I want to read, and then I'm going to read the editor's introduction to that short story. But she advises us to read her introduction to each story after we read the story, just to make sure that she doesn't spoil anything for the reader, or in this case, the listener and the reader. But I'm going to read you a little bit right here about F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is from her introduction. Again, this is Anne Margaret Daniel. I Die for You and Other Lost Stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Simon & Schuster. From the introduction. Short stories were, from the first, Fitzgerald's bread and butter. When Princeton's president, John Grier Hibben, wrote him to complain of, among other things, the characterization of a shallow university and its students in his story, The Four Fists, 1920, Fitzgerald replied, I wrote it in desperation one evening because I had a 3-inch pile of rejection slips, and it was financially necessary for me to give the magazines what they wanted. To give the magazines what they wanted. That was Fitzgerald's brief as a young writer, and he continued in this very lucrative mode through the 1920s. He sold his work for money and was acutely aware of that fact and of how much he could make quickly with short stories, as opposed to waiting until he had enough of a novel complete to consider serialization. He and his family lived well, but after the immense success of his first two novels, The Great Gatsby, published 1925, did not sell well, and he needed money. Fitzgerald's discouragement over Gatsby's lukewarm reception helped to keep him writing short stories for the Saturday Evening Post and spurred him to turn to work on screenplays in Hollywood as the Jazz Age ended. Fitzgerald was walking the tightrope between art and commerce, and he did it as well as any writer of his generation. To his editor, Maxwell Perkins at Scribner, in the same year, he was blunter and briefer. The more I get for my trash, the less I can bring myself to write. My trash for the Post grows worse and worse as there is less and less heart in it. Strange to say, my whole heart was in my first trash. I thought that the offshore pirate was quite as good as benediction. I never really wrote down until after the failure of the vegetable, and that was to make this book, Gatsby, possible. I would have written down long ago if it had been profitable. I tried it unsuccessfully for the movies. People don't seem to realize that for an intelligent man, writing down is about the hardest thing in the world. Fitzgerald always considered himself a novelist, though he was a superb writer of short fiction, not a more humble form of writing than the novel, just briefer. His short stories, loved and well-known, stand alone, but they are often a testing ground for him, a place for rough drafts, an initial space for ideas and descriptions, characters and places, elements of which would find their way into his next novel. The ledger of his life and writings, which Fitzgerald kept until 1938, lists many stories in the Record of Published Fiction section as stripped and permanently buried. That stripping process is readily visible in his tear sheets and on magazine copies of the stories he published, where Fitzgerald revised, redacted, and indicated passages that later appeared in The Beautiful and Damned, The Great Gatsby, and Tender is the Night. The stories in this collection, most of which are from the middle and late 1930s, feature lines that will be familiar to those who have read Fitzgerald's working papers, published as The Notebooks of F. Scott Fitzgerald in 1978, and The Love of the Last Tycoon, his final novel, left unfinished at his death. By F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is called Thank You for the Light. Mrs. Hanson was a pretty, somewhat faded woman of 40 who sold corsets and girdles traveling out of Chicago. For many years, her territory had swung around through Toledo, Lima, Springfield, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Fort Wayne, and her transfer to the Iowa, Kansas, Missouri district was a promotion, for her firm was strongly entrenched west of the Ohio. Eastward, however, she had known her clientele chattily and was often offered a drink or a cigarette in the buyer's office after business was concluded. But she soon found that in her new district, things were different. Not only was she never asked if she would smoke, but several times her own inquiry as to whether anyone would mind was answered half apologetically with, "It's not that I mind, but it has a bad influence on the employees." "Oh, of course, I understand." Smoking meant a lot to her sometimes. She worked very hard, and it had some ability to rest and relax her psychologically. She was a widow, and she had no close relatives to write to in the evenings, while more than one moving picture a week hurt her eyes. So that smoking had come to be an important punctuation mark in the long sentence of a day on the road. The last week of her first trip on the new circuit found her in Kansas City. It was mid August, and she felt somewhat lonely among all the new contacts of the past fortnight. And she was delighted to find at the outer desk of one firm a woman she had known in Chicago. She sat down before having herself announced, and in the course of the conversation found out a little about the man she was going to interview. Will he mind if I smoke? What? My God, yes, said her friend. He's given money to support the law against it. Oh, well, I'm grateful for the advice. More than grateful. You better watch it everywhere around here, her friend said, especially with the men over 50, the ones that weren't in the war. A man once told me that nobody who was in the war would ever object to anyone smoking. But at her very next stop, Mrs. Hanson ran into the exception. He seemed such a pleasant young man, but his eyes fixed with so much fascination on the cigarette that she tapped on her thumbnail that she put it away. She was rewarded when he asked her to lunch, and during the hour she obtained a considerable order. Afterwards, he insisted on driving her to her next appointment, though she had intended to spot a hotel in the vicinity and take a few puffs in the washroom. It was one of those days full of waiting. Everyone was busy, was late, and it seemed that when they did appear, they were the sort of hatchet-faced men who did not like other people's self-indulgence, or they were women willingly or unwillingly committed to the ideas of these men. She hadn't smoked since breakfast, and she suddenly realized that was why she felt a vague dissatisfaction at the end of each call, no matter how successful it had been in a business way. Aloud, she would say, "We think we cover a different field. It's all rubber and canvas, of course, but we do manage to put them together in a different way. A 30% increase in national advertising in 1 year tells its own story." And to herself, she was thinking, if I could just get 3 puffs, I could sell old-fashioned whalebone. She had one more store to visit now, but her engagement was not for a half an hour. That was just time to go to her hotel, but as there was no taxi in sight, she walked along the street thinking, perhaps I ought to give up cigarettes. I'm getting to be a drug fiend. Before her, she saw the Catholic cathedral. It seemed very tall. Suddenly, she had an inspiration. If so much incense had gone up in the spires to God, a little smoke in the vestibule would make little difference. How could the good Lord care if a tired woman took a few puffs in the vestibule? Nevertheless, though she was not a Catholic, the thought offended her. It didn't seem so important whether she had her cigarette, because it might offend a lot of other people, too. Still, he wouldn't mind, she thought persistently. In his days, they hadn't even discovered tobacco. She went into the church. The vestibule was dark, and she felt for a match in the bag she carried, but there wasn't any. I'll go and get a light from one of their candles, she thought. The darkness of the nave was broken only by a splash of light in a corner. She walked up the aisle toward the white blur and found that it was not made by candles, and in any case, it was going out soon. An old man was on the point of illuminating a last oil lamp. "These are votive offerings," he said. "We put them out at night. They float in the oil, and we think it means more to people that give them to save them for next day than it would to keep them burning all night. I see. He struck out the last one. There was no light left in the cathedral now, save an electric chandelier high overhead and the ever-burning lamp in front of the sacrament. "Good night," the sexton said. "Good night." "I guess you came here to pray." "Yes, I did." He went out into the sacristy. Mrs. Hanson knelt down and prayed. It had been a long time since she had prayed. She scarcely knew what to pray for, so she prayed for her employer and for the clients in Des Moines and Kansas City. When she had finished praying, she knelt up. She was not used to prayer. The image of the Madonna gazed down upon her from a niche 6 feet above her head. Vaguely, she regarded it. Then she got up from her knees and sank back wearily in the corner of the pew. In her imagination, the Virgin came down, like in the play, The Miracle, and took her place and sold corsets and girdles for her and was just tired, just as she was. Then, for a few minutes, Mrs. Hanson must have slept. She awoke at the realization that something had changed, and only gradually she perceived that there was a familiar scent that was not incense in the air and that her fingers smarted. Then she realized that the cigarette she held in her hand was alight, was burning. Still too drowsy to think, she took a puff to keep the flame alive. Then she looked up again at the Madonna's vague niche in the half-darkness. "Thank you for the light," she said. That didn't seem quite enough, so she got down on her knees, the smoke twisting up from the cigarette between her fingers. "Thank you very much for the light," she said again. From the editor. Thank You for the Light is the very short story of a traveling saleswoman pausing at the end of a long day and hoping to relax with a cigarette. That Mrs. Hanson is not only a saleswoman, but a widow, and has for many years traveled through the Midwest as a successful business person selling ladies' undergarments, might alone have been sufficient reasons for the New Yorker to reject the story in the summer of 1936. That it is intensely Catholic and concludes with a miracle further ensured its refusal. The New Yorker initially turned down the story because it was so curious and so unlike the kind of thing we associate with Fitzgerald, and really too fantastic. These are the very reasons it was popular and engendered so much critical comment when it finally did appear in their pages 76 years later on August 6, 2012. Frankenstein Tea for today. That was F. Scott Fitzgerald from a collection called I Die for You and Other Lost Stories, edited by Anne Margaret Daniel. I was going to see if I could find one quick note she made about something he uses. I don't know what the name of it is, but she says it's also used by James Joyce. I don't know if I could find it, but it's a long hyphen. I'm not sure what it's called. She has a specific name for it. I can't find it. Maybe I'll look for that for another day. But that story I just read had that long hyphen in there a few times. So some of the things the reader sees, and I hope I can convey to you, the listener. I try. Thanks for coming. This is Frankenstein Tea. I'll be here tomorrow at 3 p.m. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Peace.